we're a minute in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. I'm very excited that you all came to join us for our last session today for the Future of QMS Requirements True Quality Summit Series. Hope everybody's still awake and ready to listen about quality and risk. So our session is called Common Misconceptions on Medical Device Risk and Design Controls, which I know I enjoy. Again, happy that you could join us today and learn more about the misconceptions surrounding medical device risk. So this is going to run for about 35 minutes or so. We're going to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. I'm sure everybody's going to have questions as Rob talks. So, feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A. If you will, please put it into the Q&A box. I know sometimes the chat, it gets a little bit crazy. So please put your questions in Q&A, and we're going to reserve those until the end, and then we're going to answer those questions. So without further ado, as you can see, today we've got Rob McCuskey. Rob is a PhD and a manager of regulatory affairs at Proxima Clinical Research Incorporated. Proxima is a contract research organization focusing on assisting emerging medical device and biotech companies in regulatory, quality, and clinical development. At Proxima, Rob works on various medical device and drug product consulting projects and submissions across all stages of development. Awesome. Prior to joining the Proxima team, Rob held leadership roles at multiple startups and small businesses launching their first medical device, was the first faculty at Florida Polytech U. I'm in Florida, so awesome. And was a research chemist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So without further ado, Rob, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thanks for that wonderful intro, Nikki. Really excited to be here and be talking about a topic that I'm surprisingly passionate about, which is risk and design controls. And so hopefully if I'm the last thing between you and lunch for some people, depending on what time zone you're in, we'll end on time here, because that's always an enviable position. Just to do a quick outline, I'm going to break it into kind of two chapters. First, I'm going to focus on risk and look at some statements and myths like risk can be mitigated without having completed that part of our QMS, and it's so unlikely that this is going to happen that we don't need to write that one down, and some things about reporting risk incorrectly, basically jumping ahead, and kind of one person can think of every risk, and then move into design controls with, we can design now and wait to start our QMS, or the fact that design controls have to be perfect the first time, or they can never change, or they can always change, or they have to go in a specific order, or not setting acceptance criteria and ranges. We'll dive deeper into each of those topics. The first thing I'd like to do, since we're not all physically together, but I can't ask you to raise your hands and see you, I'd like to just get a sense if you could drop in the Q&A an answer to this poll question. Just put the letter of if you've ever done or made or contributed to a medical device risk matrix before, and if it's A, never, B, maybe you've reviewed them but not created them, or C, you've done maybe one or working on right now, or D, you're like, I've done a lot of these. I just want to get a sense of kind of where everybody's coming from and what the level of experience of the audience is here, so that I can kind of get a sense. And so seen a lot of folks that have a lot of experience at different levels, and some folks that are new to it as well. So this is great to see folks that are engaged and working in the space. So really appreciate that. Thanks to everyone who responded. All right. Well, one of the things about risk, I always like to be visual and, start with some jokes. Some people think about safety third. Well, we've all heard safety first. That's really the way that it should be. I personally have never engaged in any of those activities, as exciting as they look. There are probably some ways you could mitigate the risks involved here. So the whole point here is everything we do has risk, but how can we do that in the safest way possible? So one of the myths that I've heard, or misconceptions, is that risk can be mitigated without having completed that part of our QMS. And this one is kind of partially true. So I use what I call both and thinking, because there's two things that are true here that might seem contradictory. So it's true that risks can be identified and even mitigated, even when you're at the back of the napkin idea stage, right? So you first go into the whiteboard and thinking, man, it would be really cool if we can make a device that did this. You can already start thinking about risks and thinking about how to design it to mitigate those risks. It's never too soon to start it. However, if it's not documented in the QMS, it didn't formally happen. You're probably going to hear me say that a lot today because that's really the key. And I've got a meme up here that's a homemade meme. If it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. And this is every auditor that I've ever met. This is also myself when I am an auditor. So, you may recognize me if I've audited you in that context. But
Do you have that face
really,
though?
really, you have to write it down and document it for it to happen. So just because you're doing the good work of having the spirit of it early on and integrating it into your culture and into the thought processes and how the organization operates, you really need to make sure it's also being documented in the QMS. And so the next one is, it's so unlikely that we don't need to write this one down. Now, this is one that I kind of don't always hear people say it exactly this way or explicitly. Oftentimes, it's more discovery when we're working with clients going through their QMS, whether we're building one out for Greenlight Guru as one of their partners at Proxima. We help a lot of folks build it from scratch and implement Greenlight Guru, and we're going through this process with them together. And documenting and taking credit for everything that they're doing. And sometimes we'll be like, well, hey, what if this like thing happens where maybe like the device falls out of place? What could happen? And people are like, oh, but that's so rare, that'll never happen, don't worry about that. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a good risk. So you're telling me that the frequency is improbable. So let's write that down, because you actually have thought of it and it's now so obvious to you that it's ingrained in your thinking. But you need to really make sure that it's documented. So that's where you need to make the risk matrix really work for you. So if you've purchased the Greenlight Guru templates, this will look familiar to you with this 5x5 matrix. You can really adjust the frequencies and these probability ratings to work for your device. Whatever that means. It might be 1 in 10, it might be 1 in 10 million. You can choose this. You can even go to a 3x3 or a 4x4 or a 5x5 if that works for your organization a little bit better. I personally like 5x5. Also integrates well with Greenlight Guru's system. I've seen folks want to do 3x3 or 4x4. I mean, 5x5 to me is my personal preference, but we'll do hot takes at the end.
Hey Rob, real quick, it sounds like you're echoing a little bit. I'm not sure what changed. I don't know if,
okay.
Yeah.
Let me see. I'll see if there's anything I can do on my end. Is this getting a little bit better?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
And I'm muted, so I don't think it's me.
Okay. Let me see. I apologize about that. I don't know that this is any better yet. Let me see if I can get a headset that would be a little bit better. I'll be right back.
Gotta love technical difficulties. Sorry, guys. True. Yeah, somebody suggested maybe turning the volume down. I'm not sure.
Yeah, let me see if this is any better.
No, it's still echoing for me.
Okay, let me try one other thing.
And I am by no means a guru at tech stuff, so.
Okay, is this any better?
Yeah, you're very loud, but I'm not hearing echoing.
Okay, sorry about the volume change there. So I'll try to speak a little quieter now.
No worries.
All right, let me get the screen share back up here. Apologize about the technical difficulties there. And there we go. Yep. So ultimately, though, the point of this is that you want to make sure that your risk matrix really works for your device that you're working on and for your organization for the risk tolerance. As we all know, in quality, one of the mantras is say what you do and do what you say. So keep in mind that your team knows your device better than anyone else. And again, what works for one device may not work for another. So you can talk to your colleagues, talk to your peers, find out lessons learned, what worked for them, but remember to make it work for your company. So you can estimate these risk tolerances for low, medium, and high, and what's acceptable for your device and your company based on the matrix, how you've defined it as well. So it's important to have all this mapped out up front before you begin. And it's important to keep in mind that if you can get it to where it's a low risk and it's improbable and negligible consequences, you've still documented it, but then it's not like you have to spend a ton of effort engineering around those risks to mitigate them. So another poll, just to kind of get curious before we do the hot takes at the end, of what folks like for the size of the risk matrix that they're using in their organization. You know, A, B, or C, or D if you haven't gotten there yet, if you're just starting out. So just kind of curious to see where
looking
folks
like
land.
it's mostly C, which I'm going to be honest, I think most people kind of default to C because that's sort of the example that we get, right, in the standards that everybody kind of uses.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and that's where I land as well. So, all right, appreciate everyone sharing that. So the other one is I see folks really jumping ahead on reporting things sometimes where, you know, this is something where you have the strength of being a visionary, being in a startup, and you're able to connect dots that other people haven't seen yet. You're kind of already imagining this device is on the market and it's helping people, but it's not there yet. You're still in the process of getting there. So you have to take that strength of being a founder and an inventor and kind of take a step back and say, okay, before we started, what did this look like? So, you know, visionaries might live in the space of, well, we've got this safety cover on the e-stop push button, so people aren't going to accidentally push it anymore. So that's not even an issue. Like the frequency is so low that because there's a cover there, but you have to remember this, the current standard of care, the current state of the art before that feature was added that's new to this device may have been just the buttons hanging out there and it could accidentally be pushed. So it might happen much more frequently. And that this is in fact a risk mitigation that's reducing the frequency. So again, it's important to think about taking that step back when you go to do the risk and consider what's there. Another example might be, you know, things that are already designed into the device to make it safer and reduce the severity of things, right? Well, we don't have sharp corners on the device. It's rounded edges like a round table or a round bar stool. So we don't have to worry about the hazard from that. It's been reduced and mitigated. So we're going back and documenting that that already has happened are good examples of ways to help strengthen and again, take credit for the work that you're doing, maybe in some cases intuitive. The other one that I like to always talk about is really, you know, we all work on teams. No one person can do everything alone. You know, we've got our friend Atlas there carrying the world on his shoulders, but I'm not that strong. I'm a human, I have limitations. So, you know, I think about working in teams. I've been lucky enough to work on a lot of teams over my career, as you heard about in the intro. So, you know, this one, I really like this take on the scientist trying to figure out an elephant. This is really pandering to the immunologists in the audience here about, you know, what's the cause of what's going on here? It's a T cell, it's a B cell, the Tregs, it's cytokines, it's the environment, it's the genes. You know, and all of these might be true in some combination, and it's a much more complex picture. But we all see the world through a different lens. And so getting the perspectives of your medical advisors, getting the perspectives of end users, getting the perspectives of the engineers and the designers, and getting the perspectives of patients, you know, all of the different people that you can think about their perspectives and get input from them can help you build out and strengthen your risk matrix as you're going through and developing it. You don't have to do it alone. So let's transition now into design controls. I'm going to try to go through the talk quickly to leave time for questions at the end, because that's one of my favorite parts as well. Again, to me, design controls is all about taking the credit for the hard work that you've invested in designing this device. And so my last poll is just getting a sense of how many folks have gotten involved at various levels of doing design controls at this point, whether brand new or done a whole lot or somewhere in between.
I feel like most people are going to be between C and B for the most part on this, but looks like we've got a, oh, we've actually got quite a lot of D's.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
All right.
D, yep.
Great. Awesome.
Say
This is great.
probably no A's with the group we got here for sure.
Great. Well, one of the things that I have found in working with a lot of clients in the startup space is that there's this belief of, well, we can design now and wait to start our QMS. And this is another kind of both and statement where, again, going back to that back of the napkin ideation stage, yes, you don't have to start the QMS on day one. Putting my quality hat on, I would love to see that, but I know the reality of that is it's just not going to happen. People are going to have the ideas, they're going to start tinkering, and then you're going to realize this is a good enough idea. There is there's a there, if you will, and this is worth investing in. So at that point, things are going to spin up. So waiting to start a QMS to me is like a debt. And the longer you put it off, the bigger the debt goes and the more you're going to have to pay. Because if I need to do an hour of work on it today and I don't do it today, I got 2 hours tomorrow. And then I got 3 hours the next day. And by the end of the month, I've got 30 hours that I put off. And if I didn't have that hour today, I probably don't have that 30 hours at the end of the month either. But it's a lot easier to just integrate it and make it seamless and part of the process and build it into that muscle memory as you go so that it's a lot easier and it doesn't get out of hand. Also helps to keep in mind that 21 CFR 820 GMPs, quality system compliance, is required by law. This is not a negotiation, it has to happen. And as we stated before, if it's not documented in the QMS, it didn't happen. And so the consequence here is that if there's no design controls in the QMS, there's no device officially. It's still in that ideation stage and prototyping. And if there was a connection between, well, we've had this company and we've done all of this work, but we have no device because we have no QMS or it's not documented yet in the QMS, that can be a scary realization to come to. And so again, the sooner you can get started, the better. Another really interesting perspective that I've seen is people think that design controls have to be perfect the first time they're put into the system. They're like, well, let me just do all of the work over here on this scratch piece of paper, and then I'll load it into Greenlight Guru, and then it'll be perfect. And perfection is rarely achieved the first time. I'm not going to say never, but I'm going to say the first time I threw a dart at a dartboard, it did not land like this picture. So most auditors understand this. And if it did happen that way, they're going to be looking to see, well, are there other things that weren't documented? Because if it's too perfect, then it's likely there's something missing, and it's a red flag to start digging deeper. And we're all human, we're gonna make mistakes, and ultimately they'll find mistakes that maybe we weren't even aware that we were making, rather than just trying to push off and aim for some perfection goal that's, you know, a little unrealistic to achieve. Again, going back to taking credit, you want to be able to show we didn't get it right the first time, but here's how we responded and adapted and overcame those challenges. And then that shows auditors you're really taking it seriously and doing a great job. So they don't have to be perfect. Revisions show the dedication to what you're trying to do. And the design controls can be revised even after the design review process if new data comes in, if, you know, God forbid, validation testing means there's needs for design changes. We've actually seen clients that this happened to. They started looking at their validation software data set for software as a medical device and realized it wasn't performing the way they wanted it to. And so they stopped their testing and said, we got to go back to the drawing boards, not completely, but there's certain aspects that weren't performing. And they went back and said, we need to fix these design controls and address it. So then they went back and now they're showing that their testing is meeting the requirements that they had set. So that is a position of strength to be in. Nobody wants to tell investors, hey, it wasn't perfect the first time, we're going to hit some delays, but ultimately for them in their situation, it built credibility with their investors. And they were like, yeah, we want to be the industry leader. We want to be the best out there. And this proves that we are going to be the best and, you know, stronger than the competition. So it actually is something that you can position into a strength. Now, the opposite of this, which I've also seen, is some people think that design controls can always change. And having come from more of the, you know, bench chemist world and, you know, well, let's just keep tinkering, let's just keep making it better. At some point, and I've had bosses tell me this, you have to figure out, when are we going to launch version 1 and keep those improvements for version 2? Like, is this something that's so critical we can't go to launch? Now, I grew up in Central Florida, so I watched a lot of the space shuttle program and the rocket launches. So like, you know, there's a Falcon Heavy this week. It's pretty cool. So I think of, are the folks on the top putting the fuel into the rocket, or are they tinkering and going, maybe we can make it just a little bit better. We're going to try to fix it when we're like a day out from launch and then put things in a holding pattern. You know, growing up, it was always like, there's always this T-5 minute hold. It's like, why are we waiting? We're so close, right? Like, let's just go for it. So you have to get something out there. there can always be a version 2, there can always be a version 3, but if you get into this analysis paralysis and you're always tinkering and it resets everything back to the beginning of what you have to do for testing and what you have to do for regulatory submissions, you're now tinkering on version 3 and version 1 never made it out the door. So think of all the patients that you could have helped at that point, and there's a lot of people that you could benefit from version 1. Don't stop going for version 2 and version 3, but make sure that you've got some plan of, okay, we're going to hit some gate and we're going to lock that in and go forward. You probably know your organization and maybe are self-aware enough to know which of those two you lean towards. There's also a perception sometimes that design controls have to go in a very rigid and fixed sequence. And so this is another one of those both and situations where, yes, user needs do drive the design inputs, which drive the design outputs, which drives your design verification testing, which drives your design validation testing. And so teams can go and take a single user need and work all the way through and figure that out. Teams can also go, we're just going to identify all the user needs, and then we're going to look at all the design inputs and then all the design outputs, or you can do some mixture of both. All of that is possible. There's no one set way that it has to go. The design reviews do have to follow a fixed sequence with a little bit of an asterisk there. First of all, it's assuming that your SOPs allow this. And second of all, it's considering that you can do a partial design review. So you can do a design review on some of your user needs, but not all of them. And then maybe you could do a design review for some of your design inputs, but not all of them, and then go back and do a design review for all of the user needs, close that out and move forward. So it's possible to kind of mix and match. It depends on what your tolerance for design review meetings is. And so there gets to be a point where it's like, okay, we don't need to have a design review meeting of every single individual one. That's probably excessive. But you can group those into stages, and you can even group the stages together. You can say, look, we've got all our user needs, we've got all our design inputs, it went really well. Let's do a design review for both of those at one meeting, knock it out, do the documentation, and move on to the outputs. So you can do all of these different approaches, but ultimately you can't have your design input final design review until you've done your final design or final design review for user needs. You have to do the finals in that order. So hopefully that's not too confusing about all the multiple weaving winding paths that are out there and the options, but there is flexibility to a certain extent, again, assuming that your SOPs allow that. So the last one before we dive into Q&A is going to be about not setting acceptance criteria or ranges. I ask this question a lot. It's a great leadership question, but it's also a great practical question of, well, how do you define success? How are we going to know that this device is working as we want? I look at it as, if all of this effort has gone into making the device be as great as it is, how are we going to make sure that when the manufacturing line is making these devices, that we know each device is going to hit the success target that we so carefully set? And we want to know, why is that target acceptable? Turns out FDA will want to know that too. And why is that range acceptable? Is it a dimension, for example? What's an acceptable range for that dimension? What's the tolerances? And what's the data that you have or need to go collect to support this, depending on where you are in the process? And oftentimes there needs to be data or scientific justification to support these selections. It can't just be, all professional opinions from experts. You need to have some data to justify this at some point and say, well, this is why we chose it. So just picking an example out here, there might be, for example, a Foley catheter, and the user need is the catheter has to fit through the patient anatomy. So let's say 5 millimeters for this particular size catheter. Well, okay, that might be the opinion of our medical expert, and it's driven by the anatomy and the science. Great. So now what's the tolerance that's acceptable for that? Well, plus or minus 1 micrometer or 1 nanometer is just probably not practical from a cost of manufacturing perspective. You can set it too tight from that tolerance, but you don't want to say plus or minus a centimeter. I mean, I'm picking egregious examples to drive home the point, because it's not going to work from an anatomy requirement perspective. So you need to have some sense of what would be a reasonable tolerance, both on the lower bound and the upper bound. In this case, there may be some science of, the patient anatomy. The products can be offered in different sizes because patients have different anatomies. So, there's knowledge and experience in this space of you want to have it be able to be within a certain range based on experience from the peer-reviewed literature, for example. That might be a reasonable justification. And you can add that, survey of papers and literature and put it into the QMS and you have it, and then that's your justification and you're good to go. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and say thank you very much for your engagement and participation so far. And I'm looking forward to some great conversation in the Q&A here. And feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. My email is rob.mccuspy@proximascro.com if you want to email me as well. So thanks for your attention. Looking forward to questions.
Awesome, Rob. Thank you. Yeah, we've got a few questions. So kicking back to risk, which I feel like is going to be a lot of people's questions just because I hear these questions all the time as well. That risk matrix, the frequency, should the risk frequency be based on the production or sales of the subject device? Are there any other suggestions?
So I like to think about the risk in terms of what's the likely probability order magnitude of this happening at all. I mean, maybe this is a device for neonates. Well, it's not going to be 300 million patients in a year if it's just intended for neonates, right? So you do need to consider in your risk tolerance, is it low, medium, or high? What do we consider acceptable? How susceptible is the population? What is the hazard? How does that relate? But I would go back to fundamentally, what's the likelihood of, this device having this particular hazard take place on this patient population? Is it likely to happen frequently? Like if it's a, adhesive that's on the skin, could it tear the skin off because it's very delicate and fragile? That might be frequent. Is that something we need to consider? Is it just something that, clips on the outside of the incubator, so it, coming into contact with the infant is extremely unlikely? That's a very low probability because, it's unlikely to be placed on the inside. The odds may be so great that you would never sell that many devices, it would never happen, but maybe there's a 1 in a million chance that somehow it might get in there. It's good to still document it from that perspective and show that, yeah, it's unlikely to ever happen. So from my perspective, I like to include all the risks from the perspective of how would they happen, and then set my tolerance as a company based on, well, is it an acceptable risk, even if it's critical, like it falls on the infant and hurts them, but it's a 1 in a million chance. That may, that's a business decision and, also regulatory approval as well. But it's really a business decision to decide, is that an acceptable risk for the company and for the device?
Yeah, I feel like, in myself included, especially companies that are kind of just getting started, I think we struggle a little bit, right, with kind of understanding, all right, I don't have a product on the market. How do I even come up with these probabilities, and where does it fall? Because I haven't sold anything. So how do I know this is going to happen 1 in 10,000 times, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the ways that folks will do this is they'll talk to experts in the field. So they might talk to their medical advisory board or key opinion leaders in the space. Another is you can turn to the peer-reviewed literature, but in some cases, this is a totally innovative product, and by definition, there's no peer-reviewed literature yet, and there's no clinical experience yet. And so you do have to lean a little bit more on some of those expert opinions. And so again, this is where getting multiple perspectives might be beneficial because, I'm sure everyone's heard the joke about if you ask 5 experts for their ideas, you'll get 6 different opinions. So, but in the risk mitigation sense, it'll help you get a sense of, all right, well, one person thought it was 1 in a million, but everyone else thought it was 1 in 10,000. Maybe that 1 in a million is a little too far out there. Maybe it centers in, it's a little more frequent, but it might be manageable, for example.
Awesome, thank you. All right, this is one I hear as well and struggled with. How do you recommend constructing a risk matrix for a low risk device? And this kind of goes into some other questions. We all say that we kind of lean on that 5 by 5 because, again, that's sort of the example we're given, and it gives us the most, I think, range and flexibility. But what if your device really, when you sit down and think about it, it is so low risk, it is almost just unimaginable that it could hurt anybody?
Right. I mean, for a risk matrix, it's not like you have to have 100 entries in a risk matrix, right? If there just aren't 100 situations that can be imagined because it's such a low risk device, you may still have some number that says, look, this is an extremely, a low severity incident, and it's extremely low probability, or even if it's a high probability, it's still just such a low hazard, low severity that, this is a tolerable risk. Maybe the tongue depressor slips and scrapes someone's cheek. I mean, it could happen, but the severity is very, very minimal, so it might be tolerable, right? I mean, I'm picking an extreme example, but again, you have to know your device and think about it, and it's more about documenting what you've done and taking credit for the thought that goes into it. So, if it's in a particular situation where it's not required to go through the risk management process, if there's some kind of exemption that it doesn't have to go through, it's GMP exempt and so on and so forth, then I still recommend it from a company perspective to just understand from a business risk perspective, what's the likelihood of any of these things happening? And is this a tolerable risk for the company? So there's a lot of this spirit of QMS that benefits other aspects of the business as well.
Awesome, thank you. All right, the next one, this is an interesting one. Can we have a non-square risk matrix? I mean, really, it's kind of more rectangle.
Yeah, I've seen people propose that, and I mean, I guess there's no reason why you couldn't define a 3x4, for example, or 4x5. Again, making it work for your organization. Is if your SOPs allow it, then sure, you could consider that. If there's really only 4 hazard severities for this particular device, then that may make sense to have 4x5 or 4x3.
Yeah.
So again, make it work for your device.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to sort of the low risk as well as, usually death is that catastrophic. I can't talk today. And some people are just like, I can't get to that. Usually you have the other problem where everything leads to death, and I have to talk people off the ledge when it comes to that. It's like, think about how much goes into it before you get to death. And it's like you said, if you get 5 people in a room, one person's going to say everything leads to death, and then 4 people are going to have completely different ideas about where that risk leads. So it can get a little bit challenging at times. All right. I think the next question was about the real world statistics, and I think we kind of answered that, right? So I'm going to skip over. Our company is a repackager, relabeler. We're held responsible as if we are a manufacturer. How could we have design controls when we don't design anything?
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting regulatory question because, if you're just doing contract manufacturing and the other company is the manufacturer of record, then that other company, as a CMO, your client, that company is required to have their design controls. They're going to be the one with their name and phone number and contact info on the label. And so there still needs to be obviously a good quality management system in place. Obviously, you wouldn't be on their approved supplier list if it was any other way. But if this is a case where, as a contract manufacturer, maybe you're doing some work like I just described, and some work where you're doing the design as well, that may be a situation where you do need to have design controls for those devices that you are making. Or if a company is contracting you to do both the design and the manufacturing, then yeah, you would need to be making sure you're documenting the design controls for the design and the manufacturing. So I think that might require a little bit more nuance and specifics. So it might be good to take that one offline and dive a little bit deeper if that doesn't fully answer it. But at a high level, I would kind of start thinking about it that way.
Yeah, I do too. A lot of people, when they kind of dig into their quality manual and they're not actually designing anything, we say, well, look at that clause 7 of 1345. If it doesn't apply, then you just need to say that it doesn't and why. But also try to have a relationship with the people that you're working with, right? Because again, I've been in this situation where somebody is an OEM and they don't want to give you too much as far as like information so that you can actually develop your design controls. But you want to be able to get that information, right, if needed. So I always say it's have a good agreement in place, right?
Absolutely. Great advice, Nikki.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any suggestions for documenting design controls for patient-specific devices that don't meet the definition of a custom device, but also don't have any standard dimensions, such as products from a dental lab? Hmm.
Yeah, so dental has its own unique regulation space,
Okay.
interestingly. So I think that's one that I would want to take offline and learn a little bit more about the device and kind of understand, um, is there maybe a way to create some design controls that aren't based around a fixed dimension of it has to be 5 millimeters diameter, for example, but maybe there's something else that could be implemented. So um, I think I think I need to have a little bit deeper conversation on that one.
Yeah, I wonder if that could also kind of point back to sort of how we're getting into this 3D printed world, right? Where everything would kind of be custom. I would still think you would have processes in place in your manufacturing, but then yeah, it would be custom. Because I'm trying to think about my past. We kind of, and we weren't in the market yet, but we actually did cell regeneration, and so that was person to person. You didn't have a product that you just created. It was, I took tissue from you, we replicated your cells and put it back out there. So very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there might be a way to say, if you're 3D printing something based off of a cast or a mold or a 3D scan of the device, is it, to a certain tolerance of that particular patient's cast
Mhm.
or mold, right? So it's not saying it has to be 5 millimeters diameter, but maybe it has to be within some tolerance of, the target. Like with what you were describing, maybe you don't say, okay, the cells are going to have a certain set of genes turned on and off, but maybe
Yeah,
we're going to certify that they're viable or something.
that's it.
There might be some ways to think through it. So that I would actually enjoy having that question offline. So feel free to reach out. We'll talk about it
Yeah,
more later.
yeah, thank you. That was Brian. He didn't put his last name, but all right. Do you have any specific recommendations? This is back to risk. Any specific recommendations on risk assessment related to a de novo submission and the risk benefit profile analysis?
Yeah. So going through a de novo information request right now with one client, I can definitely speak to this. Um, my recommendation is to be as thorough as you can in thinking of through, what are the risks in relation to the patient, and try to put your FDA reviewer hat on a little bit too, right? The FDA is trying to say, we want to make sure this device is safe and effective. And we want to make sure that in the future, if anyone tries to make another version of this, what regulations are we going to need to put in place? What are we going to need to see in their future 510K submission to make sure that the Me Too device is also safe and effective? And so the opportunity of a de novo is you're getting to set that regulatory bar for the competition that everyone that follows you is going to have to go over to enter the marketplace. You're kind of helping FDA see what they need to set the bar at. So you can use the risk assessment to really help drive that.
Mhm.
And so again, I would say just make sure you're following your SOPs, make sure you're documenting it well, and make sure that you're trying to think patient-centric of what are these risks on the outcomes, and making sure that you can speak to it knowledgeably, either in narrative format or as required in additional meetings.
So thank you. I also want to just let everybody know that I just dropped a link into the chat. It's actually a survey that's going to take you to do a survey on this afterwards, and then you'll get a chance to win $100 and a donation of $100 to Project Cure. So I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention as well. So very cool. All right, answer that. All right, can you speak to the types of records that FDA might expect to see in submissions or inspections when they adopt 14971 by way of QMSR as regulation rather than recognized standard?
So this is kind of asking me to speculate a little bit, I would guess, about once FDA moves towards 14 ISO 14971 for the ways of doing risk assessment. Um, I, I can't promise what they are or are not yet. However, I would say that when you're doing your risk analysis, that if you're getting the appropriate records to say, okay, we did some interviews with experts to kind of medical experts, like we talked to medical advisory board, and we've got transcripts of those interviews. You can have that documentation. If you surveyed peer-reviewed literature, if you have it on the market and you've gotten customer complaints and you're updating it, you can put all of these types of records into your documentation, supporting each of these individual risks that you're identifying and why you feel they have a certain severity or probability. So I would say from that perspective, just thinking about your general process of how you would try to document things would be the way that I would be trying to position my QMS if I were thinking forward about that right now.
Thank you. All right. Interesting. This is an interesting one from Johnny. What happens if there are secondary consequences of the device? For example, depression after a diagnosis from the device. Okay.
Yeah, so we do have several clients that are working in the mental health space, and I can, speaking to depression specifically, FDA is very concerned about, could this trigger an increase in suicidality for patients in that population? Because that's a very big safety concern for whether it be a drug or a device in that space. And so when you think about those consequences, I would say, think about it from the perspective of, if this is one step away and directly tied to an outcome or an action of this device, then I would include that in the risk assessment as a potential risk, right? So if say my device provided a diagnosis that's, likely or potentially could trigger depression in a patient population after they receive this diagnosis, if there's literature to substantiate it, that would be great. Or if there's, evidence from practitioners that are seeing it happen when they deliver that diagnosis in person, you could get some evidence of that. And so I would consider that as, a consequence of the device's action or outcome. This I'm thinking more in terms of, if this is intended to have continued effects, beyond just diagnosing, it's maybe going to provide a diagnosis and then provide a customized therapy based on that. That's kind of the context I'm thinking, where it's a lot more clear. If you're thinking about, say, just an in vitro diagnostic device and it's providing a diagnosis, then I think that one you'd have to, and it's just providing that information, I think you'd have to think, what you could definitely put it in the risk matrix and show that you considered it, and then decide, is that something that you really would need to address? Is that something that goes into the risk tolerance level where it needs to be addressed?
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. Could you elaborate on user interface evaluation versus user validation versus clinical evaluation?
Sure. So I'm going to just put some assumptions out there of what I think these terms mean. And if it's not, then feel free to reach out to me afterwards and I can clarify. To me, user interface evaluation really relates to usability type studies and human factors type studies. Is the patient or the user able to understand the display? Maybe it's reading out my blood pressure. Can the patient understand that that's their blood pressure? By user validation, if this is a cybersecurity term, then I would defer to some cybersecurity experts on that. Validating, is this user in fact the real user? But if this is relating to more of a design validation perspective, then I would say you would refer to your design controls and your DHF to kind of guide you for what that would be. If you're saying, could we validate that the user actually got the benefit of this device? I think that would definitely fall in your design controls. And then clinical evaluation is going to be whether you have clinical studies or clinical trials and you're looking at how does this device perform in the clinic. And a lot of times that supports your design validation test, design, and your study protocols are going to support that. It may be required, it may not be required, depending on the type of the device and its classification. So at a high level, I'd say that's how I would think of it without being able to follow up more on the specifics.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. How to handle EU MDR's requirement of having to reduce risk as far as possible and not only until the manufacturer finds it acceptable.
That's a good one. I do want to say all of these questions are really great. So, this is where, as far as possible, leaves a lot of room open for interpretation. Because at what point do you say that's as far as possible? It's nearly impossible from one perspective to say I can guarantee complete safety in every situation. Well, we can't imagine every single situation that's possible in advance. However, I think this is more going towards the spirit of, okay, is there still something that can be done to lower the risk? So if there's, maybe we could put foam on the corners, or we could make it a rounded design. If a rounded design would really remove the risk of somebody snagging their clothes on the corner and causing other issues, they're really trying to push you to say, look for that rounded design option versus the corners that have the padding. And so that, I think, is the spirit of it. But like all of these, the devil's in the details. And so I think it's going to, probably be another good one for an offline conversation to dive a little bit deeper.
Awesome. Thank you. Any suggestions for the best practice of benefit risk analysis?
I mean, I'm going to just kind of go to my general approach for benefit risk analysis. And, we try to lay out clearly all of the benefits of the device. We try to, again, have the most scientific justification that we can. Sometimes you can't because it's new and innovative and you're just, inferring it using common sense. But you want to make sure that the benefits are as clearly supported and as strongly supported as you can. And then when you go to the risks, you're going to talk about, this is the risk matrix. These are the steps we can take to mitigate those risks. This is the residual risk. If, for example, if it's a surgically implanted device, there's always risks with any surgery. And so those can't be mitigated. It's surgery. However, the benefit to the patient may exceed what those risks are. And so that's where you have to really make it a clear and compelling case to say, hey, for an implantable cardiac pacemaker, it's going to really benefit the patient. It's worth the risks of the surgery to use that device. So that's where, again, it's really, to me, about that persuasive writing and persuasive logic to really present the case. But it has to all be grounded in the science and the facts and the data everywhere that's possible, so that it's not an argument of opinions, but a data-driven decision as much as that is possible.
Yep. All right. Will filing be more scrutinized for a new company launching a new product?
Well, I'm not an FDA reviewer, so I can't promise whether it would or wouldn't. And I would hope that FDA would give the same scrutiny to every submission.
Yeah.
But what I can say is that in my experience, when it comes to FDA wanting to audit manufacturers, they do seem to like to knock on the door of folks that are new pretty soon after they've launched a new product and opened their doors and just say, hey, how's it going? How are those DHF files looking? How's your QMS looking? Have you gotten any CAPAs yet? It just seems to be a pattern that auditors like to visit the new companies that are out there. So that's where I would encourage, again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Get the QMS in place early, do a great job from the beginning, and then the audit will just be a celebration of, hey, that went really well, and FDA said we're doing great, so high five.
Yep. I see some people are saying that the chat does, or sorry, I guess the chat's disabled, and so they don't see the link. Let me, I'm gonna say real quick before we run out of time, let me try to put this link in the Q&A, and then I'm gonna put it at the bottom. Well, I don't even know if I can actually. Well, what I'll try to, I'm not sure about why that didn't work. Let me try putting it on everyone and see if I'm changing it to everyone. Maybe that worked. Let me know if you guys still can't see it. All right. Sorry about that. I know we're right at time. Let's see. I was gonna. Yeah. All right. Everything's working. Cool. All right. Well, like I said, I know we've got a few more questions. So hopefully we can kind of take those offline maybe and get those answered. But yeah, I got the survey in the chat. So if you can take a moment, maybe copy and paste that so you can definitely take that survey, get entered in to win a chance to win $100. And again, we're going to donate $100 to Project Cure. Thank you again, Rob. This has been amazing. I know everybody is always got tons of questions about risk and design controls. I feel like that's the meat and potatoes of what we're doing in product development. And that's going to do it for today's Future of QMS Requirements, everyone. Thank you so much. The recording is going to be posted online, so you should be able to go into the Academy and see this in case you missed anything or you want to show it to folks in your organization. And make sure to watch for any content you may have missed.